The hiss of steam was the first sound of dust smear, a long, weary sigh as the iron horse surrendered to the end of the line. It was a sound that settled into the bones, much like the fine red dust that followed. The dust was everywhere. It rose in a soft, bloody cloud from under the train's slowing wheels, clung to the rough-hewn boards of the station platform, and painted a hazy film across the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. From her window, Clara Jane Whitmore had watched the world bleed from green to brown to a burnt, unforgiving ochre. Now, seeing the town for the first time, she understood its name. It wasn't a place that had been built. It was a place that dust had permitted to exist, for now. The wind was the second thing she noticed. It was not a gentle breeze. It was a restless, insistent thing that scurried along the single main street, worrying the corners of canvas awnings and whispering secrets through the cracks of false-fronted buildings. It lifted the hem of her modest gray traveling dress as she stepped from the carriage onto the platform, a cold and unwelcome touch against her ankles. Her hand, gloved in worn but clean black cotton, tightened its grip on the handle of her scuffed leather valise. Inside that valise was everything she owned: 2 other dresses, a change of linen, a brush and comb, a small book of poems, and the letter. The letter was the most important thing. It was her map, her anchor, her reason for breathing the gritty air of this God-forsaken town. She could feel its crisp edges through the fabric of her bodice, tucked safely against her heart. 4 pages, written in a strong, clear hand by a man named Caleb Rourke, a man who had advertised for a wife in an Eastern newspaper, a man who had read her careful, honest reply and had written back not once, but 3 times. His letter spoke of a new life, of building something solid and respectable in a land of opportunity. He owned the Mercantile. He'd written. He was a man of some standing. He sought a companion of good character, a woman who was not afraid of hard work and solitude. Clara Jane Whitmore, at 28 years of age, was afraid of very little. Hardship was the only parent she had ever truly known. Solitude had been her most constant companion. As for her character, she had guarded it with the ferocity of a she-wolf, polishing it daily against the tarnish of her birth. Her mother had been a woman of the stage, a singer whose voice filled smoky theaters and whose laughter was bought as easily as a drink. Her father was a name her mother had whispered only once, a wealthy man from a good family who had paid for his pleasure and then vanished, leaving behind nothing but a daughter with his dark hair and a legacy of shame. Clara had spent her life running from that legacy. She had worked as a seamstress, a laundress, a lady's companion, any quiet, respectable work she could find. She kept her eyes downcast, her voice soft, her hands busy. She built a wall around herself, brick by invisible brick, a fortress of propriety designed to keep the world's judgment at bay. But the past had long coattails, and whispers always found a way through the cracks. The shadow of her mother, of the life she'd led, was a stain that no amount of lye soap or pious silence could ever seem to wash away. Mr. Rourke's letter had felt like a clean slate, a place so far west, so new, that the shadows couldn't reach it. A man who knew nothing of her, who would see only the woman she had painstakingly built, not the ghost of the one she came from. She smoothed the front of her dress, took a steadying breath that tasted of dust and coal smoke, and scanned the platform. A few dusty-looking men in broad-brimmed hats were unloading freight. A woman with 2 small children hurried past, pulling them close as if the very air around the train was a contagion. And then she saw him. He matched the small, faded photograph he had sent. A man of medium height, with a neat brown beard and a starched collar that seemed to be actively strangling him. He stood near the station master's office, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands, his eyes darting over the few disembarking passengers. A fragile tendril of hope unfurled in Clara's chest. She started towards him, her steps measured, her back straight. This was it, the first moment of the rest of her life. His eyes met hers, and for a second, she saw a flicker of recognition, of the confirmation she had prayed for, but it was immediately extinguished, replaced by something else, something closed and cold. His gaze slid away from her face, down to her valise, then back up, lingering for a moment on her jawline before skittering away to a point somewhere over her shoulder. He did not smile. He did not move towards her. A knot of ice formed in Clara's stomach. She stopped a few feet from him. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her cheek. "Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice quieter than she'd intended. He flinched, as if the sound of his own name was an accusation. He cleared his throat, his eyes still fixed on the wall behind her. "Miss Whitmore," he mumbled. The words came out flat, without welcome. "I am here, as we agreed," she said, forcing a calm she did not feel into her tone. The letter against her skin suddenly felt like a block of ice. "Yes, well, there seems to have been a misunderstanding," he said, finally forcing himself to look at her. His eyes were the color of faded denim, and they were filled with a miserable sort of panic. A misunderstanding, the words were a faint echo. The tendril of hope in her chest withered and died. "A gentleman on the train," Caleb Rourke began, his voice gaining a slight edge of self-righteous justification. "A Mr. Abernathy, from St. Joseph. He recognized you. He spoke of your time there." Clara's blood ran cold. St. Joseph. 3 years ago, she had worked for a milliner, a perfectly respectable position, but the milliner's shop was next to the Grand Theater, and her mother had performed on that stage a decade earlier. The association was enough. The whispers had started. The wives of the town's important men had stopped coming in, and Clara had been quietly dismissed. She had thought she had left that ghost behind in Missouri. "He spoke of your connections," Rourke continued, unable to bring himself to say the words. "To the theater, to that sort of life." Clara stood perfectly still. The sounds of the station, the shouting of the freight men, the whinny of a horse, the relentless wind faded into a dull roar. The only thing that was real was this man's face, his weak chin, the sweat beading on his upper lip despite the dry air. He was a small man, she realized, small and frightened. "The life my mother led is not my own." "Mr. Rourke," she said, and she was proud of the steadiness of her voice. It felt like it was coming from someone else, some stronger, braver woman standing in her shoes. "I made that clear in my letters. My life has been one of honest, respectable work. Respectability is a fragile thing out here." "Miss Whitmore," he retorted, his voice rising slightly. "A man's reputation is all he has. The owner of the town mercantile. He must be above reproach. His wife, even more so." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes was the final, killing blow. It was not anger or hatred. It was dismissal. In his mind, she was already judged, convicted, and sentenced by the sins of her mother. The blood in her veins was tainted, and no amount of hard work or quiet dignity could ever purify it. He took a half step back, as if she might suddenly contaminate him. "I am sorry for your long journey," he said, the apology a hollow, meaningless courtesy. "But we cannot proceed. It would be unsuitable." He turned then, a crisp, final turn of his heel on the dusty boards, and walked away without another word. He did not look back. He simply dissolved into the dusty street, a respectable man preserving his fragile reputation, leaving her standing alone on the platform with the full weight of her unsuitability. Clara did not move for a long time. She watched him go, watched the door of the building marked Rourke's Mercantile swing shut behind him. The sun beat down on her head. The wind tugged at her skirts, a persistent, mocking ghost. The valise in her hand now felt impossibly heavy, filled not with her meager possessions, but with the crushing weight of a future that had just vanished into thin air. She could feel the eyes on her. The station master, pretending to be busy with a manifest. the freight men, who had paused in their work to watch the small, cruel drama unfold. Their gazes were a mixture of curiosity and a vague, detached pity that was somehow worse than scorn. She was a spectacle, a woman alone, rejected, at the end of the line. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her chin. She turned her back on the station, on the railroad tracks that had carried her here on a current of false hope. She faced the town of Dustmere. It looked no different than it had 10 minutes ago. Yet everything had changed. It was no longer a place of new beginnings, but a hostile, foreign shore on which she had just been shipwrecked, with nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and less than $5 in her reticule. She did the only thing she knew how to do. She took a step, and then another. She walked off the platform and into the red dust of the street, her back straight, her face a mask of calm composure. She would not let them see her break. As she stepped into the main thoroughfare, a movement across the way caught her eye. Leaning against the shaded wall of the blacksmith shop was a man. He was tall, taller than most, and stood with a stillness that set him apart from the town's nervous energy. He wasn't looking at her with the overt curiosity of the others. His face was shadowed by the brim of a dark, dusty hat, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. It wasn't a prying look, nor was it judgmental. It was observant, quiet. It was the look of a man who was accustomed to watching, to seeing things that others missed, while the rest of the town saw a rejected woman. His gaze seemed to penetrate deeper, to the core of the unbending pride that was holding her together. Their eyes met for only a fraction of a second, a brief, silent acknowledgement across a dusty expanse. Then she lowered her gaze and continued walking, her destination unknown, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. But the sensation of that singular, steady gaze followed her, a silent question mark in a day full of brutal answers. The walk through Dustmere was a trial by 100 silent judgments. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the churned red dirt of the street before her, but she felt the stares like physical things, small pinpricks against her skin. Windows were not just glass and wood, they were frames for curious, speculative faces. Men paused their whittling on porch steps, their knives held still as their eyes followed her progress. Women, sweeping dust from their own doorsteps, stopped their brooms and watched, their lips pressed into thin, hard lines. She was an anomaly, a woman, alone, with a traveling case and no one to meet her. Her public rejection by Caleb Rourke had already become the town's newest piece of gossip, a story passed in swift, knowing glances from the station all the way down the single, bleak street. Every step was an act of will. She forced her shoulders back, her spine straight, her pace even. Inside, a storm of humiliation and fear raged, but on the outside, she was a fortress of composure. She passed the Mercantile, its windows glinting in the afternoon sun, and did not allow herself to look. She passed the saloon, from which the tinny sound of a poorly played piano and a burst of rough laughter spilled out. She passed the sheriff's office, the assayers, the church with its lonely, unpainted steeple clawing at the sky. At the very end of the street, where the town seemed to fray and surrender back to the sparse, scrubby wilderness, stood a 2-story building that had once been painted a hopeful white. Now, the paint was peeling in long, sun-bleached strips, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath. A simple sign, its letters faded but still legible, hung from a single hinge, Green's boarding house, rooms and victuals. It looked like the last house in the world. For Clara, it was the only house. She mounted the 3 steps to the porch, the wood groaning under her weight. The front door was ajar. She hesitated for only a moment before rapping her knuckles against the solid wood. The woman who answered was built like the gnarled, hardy trees that dotted the landscape. She was of indeterminate age, somewhere between 50 and 70, with hands that were chapped and strong from work. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe, practical bun, and her eyes, the color of faded slate, were sharp and missed nothing. She wiped her hands on a flour-dusted apron and looked Clara up and down in a single, comprehensive sweep. It was not an unkind look, but it was entirely without sentiment. "Yes," the woman said. Her voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. "I'm looking for a room," Clara said, her voice steady. The woman's gaze flickered to the valise, then back to Clara's face. She registered the good quality, though worn, fabric of Clara's dress, the clean gloves, the exhaustion that even Clara's iron will could not entirely mask. She had seen the train come in. She had likely heard the story already. "You got money for a room?" The question was blunt, a stone thrown into the fragile pool of Clara's composure. "I have some," Clara answered honestly. "Not enough for very long." The woman grunted, a sound of acknowledgement, not surprise. She looked past Clara, down the dusty street toward the center of town. "Saw you talking with Caleb Rourke," she stated, not asked. Clara's jaw tightened. She simply nodded, offering no explanation. The shame was a hot coal in her throat. The woman held her gaze for a long moment, and in her slate-gray eyes, Clara saw not pity, but a flicker of something else, a hard-won understanding. Perhaps this was a woman who knew that life was not a gentle thing. "I'm Millie Green," she said finally, stepping back from the door. "Room's $2 a week, meals included. You can pay later." She paused, and her eyes narrowed slightly. "Driving the point home, but I don't give handouts. You work. Bed needs changing in room 4. Potatoes need peeling for supper. Firewood needs bringing in from the back." Relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed over Clara. There were no prying questions, no demand for her history, no judgment in the offer. There was only a transaction, stark and simple. A room for labor, a roof for sweat. It was a language she understood. "Thank you, Mrs. Green," Clara said, her voice thick with an emotion she quickly suppressed. "I'm a hard worker." "We'll see," Millie Green said, turning and leading her into a dim, clean hallway that smelled of soap and roasting meat. "Room's at the top of the stairs. Put your things down and come straight to the kitchen. The potatoes won't peel themselves." And so Clara's life in Dustmere began. It was a life measured not in hours, but in tasks. She stripped the bed and washed the linens in a tub of harsh lye soap until her knuckles were raw. She sat at the long wooden table in the kitchen, a mountain of potatoes before her, and peeled until her hands cramped, the rhythmic scrape of the knife a strange, soothing balm to her fractured thoughts. She hauled buckets of water from the pump out back, her arms and shoulders screaming in protest. She swept the floors, darned a tear in a tablecloth, and helped Millie serve the evening meal to the 3 other boarders, a pair of taciturn minors and a young, sallow-faced clerk from the assayer's office. Through it all, she was silent. The silence was her armor. She performed each task with a focused, quiet efficiency that left no room for conversation. She answered Millie's direct questions with a soft "yes, ma'am" or "no, ma'am," and volunteered nothing more. The men ate their meal with their heads bent over their plates, occasionally mumbling to each other about veins of silver and the price of blasting powder. They glanced at her from under their brows, their curiosity palpable, but her detached, formal demeanor gave them no opening. She was a ghost at their table, a pair of hands that filled their plates and cleared them away. Nothing more. By the time the last plate was washed and the kitchen was clean, a deep purple dusk had settled over the town. The relentless wind had died down, leaving behind a profound stillness. Every muscle in Clara's body ached with a deep, satisfying pain. It was the ache of honest work, a feeling so pure and straightforward it felt like a cleansing. It was a pain that crowded out the sharper, more complicated ache in her heart. Millie handed her a small piece of leftover cornbread wrapped in a cloth. "Eat this," she commanded. "There's one more bucket of water to bring in for the morning." Clara nodded, her throat too tight with gratitude to speak. She took the bread and went out the back door into the cool night air. The sky was a vast, dark canvas pricked with an impossible number of stars. They seemed colder and brighter here than they ever had in the east, like chips of ice scattered on black velvet. The air was thin and smelled of pine and dust. The water pump stood near a small wood pile, a skeletal iron sentinel in the moonlight. She placed her cornbread on the edge of the trough and began to work the handle. The pump was stiff and reluctant, groaning with each pull. The rhythmic squeak and the splash of water into the bucket were the only sounds in the quiet yard. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the physical exertion eclipse everything else. Here, at the edge of town, with her back to the houses and their judging eyes, she could almost feel a sliver of peace. A soft crunch of a boot on the dry ground behind her made her entire body go rigid. She stopped pumping, her hand frozen on the handle, her heart leaping into her throat. She did not turn. "Evening, ma'am." The voice was deep and unexpectedly quiet. It wasn't the voice of a drunk stumbling from the saloon. It was measured, calm. She slowly turned her head. He was standing a few feet away, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette against the star-dusted sky. It was the man from the blacksmith shop, the one who had watched her from across the street. In the dim light, she could make out a strong, angular jaw and the shadow of his hat pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't crowding her, but his presence filled the small space. She said nothing, simply watched him, her hand still gripping the cold iron of the pump handle. He took a slow step forward into a stray shaft of moonlight from the kitchen window. She saw his face more clearly now. It was a hard face, weathered by sun and wind, and not handsome in the way Caleb Rourke might have been considered handsome. It was something else entirely. It was a landscape of a face, carved with the lines of experience she couldn't begin to guess at. And his eyes, even in the shadows, seemed to hold that same unnerving, observant quality she had noticed earlier. He held out his hand. In it was a clean, folded square of white cotton, a handkerchief. Clara glanced down at her own hand, still clenched around the pump handle. A long, angry red scrape ran across her knuckles where she had grazed them against the side of the washtub. A single drop of blood welled on the surface. She hadn't even noticed. She looked back at him, confused. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward her hand. "Saw you from my window," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Looked like you were working up a storm." She slowly released the pump handle and took the offered handkerchief. The cotton was soft and clean. She pressed it against her bleeding knuckle. The small, unexpected act of kindness so disarming, she felt a dangerous prickling behind her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave another small nod, his gaze steady. He seemed entirely comfortable in the silence, which unnerved her more than a barrage of questions would have. He wasn't trying to pry. He was just there. "I'm Sawyer Bell," he said at last, breaking the quiet. "My place is nearby, just through those trees." He gestured with his chin toward the darkness beyond Millie's property. Clara simply nodded, dabbing at her hand. He shifted his weight, his eyes scanning her face in the dim light. "Folks tend to look at me strange," he said, his voice flat, a simple statement of fact. Then his gaze met hers, direct and unwavering. "You too." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't pity. It was a bridge, built of two simple words across the chasm of their shared isolation. He was naming the thing that had haunted her all day, all her life. He was acknowledging that he, too, lived on the outside. In that moment, he saw her not as the woman Caleb Rourke had rejected, or the mysterious newcomer, or the woman with the sullied past. He saw her as a fellow creature marked by the world's unkind gaze. For the first time since stepping off the train, Clara felt a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding release from her lungs. She looked from the tall, quiet man before her, to the dark, indifferent town behind him, and back again. She didn't know who Sawyer Bell was, or what made the townsfolk look at him strangely, but in the cool, starry quiet of the backyard. She knew she was no longer entirely alone in her otherness. The days at Millie Green's boarding house settled into a rhythm, as stark and predictable as the rising and setting of the high desert sun. Clara's life became a well-worn path between the kitchen, the laundry tubs, and the rooms of the boarders. She rose before dawn, her hands finding the cold iron of the water pump in the dark. She worked until long after dusk, her body moving through a litany of chores until exhaustion finally granted her a few hours of dreamless sleep. The physical labor was a mercy. It built a wall of fatigue between her and the raw, gaping wound of her arrival in Dustmere. She learned the town not through exploration, but through overheard scraps of conversation at the supper table. The two miners, Jeb and Al, spoke of rockfalls and dwindling pay. The young clerk, Mr. Abernathy, complained of the dust and the poor quality of the ink. They spoke of Caleb Rourke's stinginess, of the sheriff's fondness for the whiskey at the saloon. And one evening, as a chill wind howled outside, rattling the window panes in their frames, they spoke of Sawyer Bell. It began with a complaint from Jeb about the price of firewood. Told me the price was the price. He grumbled around a mouthful of stew. Man of few words, that Bell. Fewer words is better, with his kind, Al muttered, not looking up from his plate. Best not to ask what he did to earn the money to buy that patch of timber in the first place. Clara, refilling a water pitcher at the sideboard, went still. Her back was to the table, but her entire being was focused on their words. They say he was a bounty man, Jeb said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble. Down in the territories, hunted men for a living. Mr. Abernathy, the clerk, looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Is that true? Al shrugged, sawing at a piece of tough beef. Never heard him say so. Never heard anyone brave enough to ask. But he's got the look, and he pays for everything in coin. Never credit. A man who deals in cash and solitude has his reasons. He paused, leaning forward slightly. Old man Hemlock, the blacksmith, told me once that Bell rode in 3 years ago with a nasty-looking rifle and the devil in his eyes. Said he killed men. More than a few. The words hung in the air of the small dining room, heavy as lead. Killed men. The phrase seemed to suck the warmth from the room. Clara's hand tightened on the pitcher, her knuckles white. She thought of the quiet man in the starlight, of the clean handkerchief he'd offered, of his deep voice stating a simple fact of their shared existence. She tried to reconcile that image with the one the miners were painting, a hunter of men, a killer. The two realities felt impossible, like trying to hold fire and water in the same hand. She turned from the sideboard, her face a carefully blank mask, and placed the pitcher on the table. The men fell silent as she approached, their eyes flicking towards her before returning to their food. They did not know of her brief encounter with Sawyer Bell, but her presence was a reminder that a woman was in the room, and the conversation shifted to the safer topic of the coming winter. But the words had been spoken, and they took root in Clara's mind, a seed of dark, unsettling curiosity. Weeks bled into one another. The days grew shorter, the nights sharper. The first frost silvered the land, and the wind developed a new, more vicious bite. Clara worked, saved the meager pay Millie gave her, and watched the small world of Dustmere from her quiet, lonely orbit. She saw Sawyer Bell occasionally. Sometimes she would see him in town, loading supplies onto a mule, moving with an unhurried economy of motion that was riveting to watch. He never loitered, never engaged in idle chat. He conducted his business and then disappeared back toward the trees that fringed the edge of town. He always nodded to her, a brief, respectful dip of his head. She would nod back, her heart giving a strange, unaccountable flutter. The rumors made him a figure of danger, but his eyes, when they met hers, held only a quiet gravity. One night, the cold that had been threatening for weeks descended in full force. It was a bitter, invasive cold that seeped through the cracks in the walls and floorboards of the old boarding house. The fire in the main stove roared, but it seemed to beat back the chill by mere inches. The boarders ate their supper huddled in their coats. By 9 o'clock, the wind had risen to a shrieking gale, throwing handfuls of sleet against the windows like pebbles. Then the lamps began to flicker. Millie swore under her breath, checking the oil in the main lamp. Knew I was low, she grumbled. That blasted provision wagon is 2 days late. One by one, the lights in the house sputtered and died, plunging the rooms into a near-total darkness, broken only by the faint, hungry glow of the fire's embers. The cold, which had been held at bay, seemed to surge into the house, a palpable, living thing. The boarders shuffled off to their rooms, grumbling about the cold and the dark. Clara, tasked with making sure the fire was safely banked for the night, was standing by the hearth when a firm, solid knock sounded on the front door. Millie, holding a single, sputtering candle, went to answer it, her face set in a scowl of annoyance. "Who in God's name is out in this?" she muttered. She pulled the door open, and a blast of frigid air swept into the hall. Framed in the doorway, his shoulders dusted with ice, was Sawyer Bell. He held a large, heavily laden wooden crate in his arms. "Mrs. Green," he said, his deep voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "Figured you might be running low on wood, with this storm blowing in." Millie's expression softened from annoyance to surprise. "Belle, you didn't have to do that." "Easier than listening to your boarders complain all the way from my cabin," he said. It was the closest thing to a joke Clara had ever heard him make. He stepped inside, placing the crate of perfectly split, dry pine wood on the floor. The scent of it, clean and sharp, filled the hall. He straightened up, and his eyes found Clara in the flickering firelight. She stood by the hearth, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her face pale in the gloom. He looked from her to the dying fire, then back to her. The house was groaning around them, a chorus of creaks and rattles as the wind assaulted it from all sides. He looked back at Millie. "The wind's likely to bring a chimney flue down on an old house like this. My cabin is small, but it's new-built and solid. The stove draws clean." He turned his gaze fully to Clara. The invitation was not for Millie, or the miners, or the clerk. It was just for her. "If you need a warmer place," he said, his voice quiet but clear over the storm, "you're welcome to it." The world seemed to stop. The wind, the cold, the darkness, it all receded, leaving only the two of them standing in the firelight. It was an offer of simple, practical shelter, but it was more than that. It was a choice. She could stay here, in the known world of the cold, dark boarding house, shivering through the night. Or she could step out into the storm and follow this man, this rumored killer, this quiet observer, into the unknown. The miner's words echoed in her mind, *killed men*. Millie Green looked from Sawyer to Clara, her shrewd eyes taking in the entire situation. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent granting of permission. Clara looked at Sawyer's face. In the dim light, she saw no threat, no hidden motive. She saw only a calm strength, and the same quiet recognition she'd seen that first night. He wasn't offering pity. He was offering warmth, as simply and directly as he had offered his handkerchief. He was treating her like a person, not a problem. "I'll get my coat," she said. The walk through the woods was a wild, breathtaking ordeal. The wind tore at them, trying to rip the breath from their lungs. Sawyer went first, a lantern in one hand, his broad back a shield against the worst of the gale. Clara followed in his footsteps, her head down, clutching her thickest shawl over her coat. The journey was short, but it felt like crossing into another world. The moment they stepped into the thicket of pines, the roar of the wind lessened, muffled by the dense branches. The air was still and cold and smelled powerfully of resin. His cabin was exactly what she would have expected: small, simple, and impeccably built. It was a single room, with a sturdy bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs in the center, and shelves holding a few books and neatly stacked tins of food. A massive stone fireplace and a cast-iron stove dominated one wall. The place was Spartan, but it was meticulously clean and orderly. It was the home of a man who was entirely self-sufficient, who had pared his life down to the essentials. Without a word, Sawyer moved to the stove, opened the grate, and with practiced efficiency, built a fire. Within minutes, a cheerful, crackling warmth began to push back the bone-deep chill. He then put a kettle of water on to heat. Clara stood near the growing fire, thawing her frozen fingers. Watching him, he moved with a quiet confidence, a man completely at ease in his own space. He brought 2 tin mugs of steaming black tea to the table and gestured for her to sit. They sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the muffled howl of the wind outside. The warmth from the stove was a blissful comfort, seeping into her very bones. She held the hot mug in both hands, letting the steam warm her face. The silence between them wasn't awkward or strained. It was a comfortable, shared quiet. As he reached for his mug, the firelight caught the side of his neck. For the first time, she saw it clearly. A scar. It was not a thin, pale line, but a wide, puckered ribbon of flesh that started just below his left ear, tracing a brutal path down the side of his neck, disappearing under the collar of his shirt to what she could only guess was his shoulder. It was an old wound, long healed, but its violence was unmistakable. It was the kind of mark left by a knife, or a shard of glass, or something far worse. It was the physical proof of the life the miners had whispered about. Her eyes fixed on it, a morbid fascination taking hold. Her mind flooded with questions. Asterisk. How did it happen? Who did it? Was it in a fight? Did it happen when you were hunting men? Asterisk. The words were on the tip of her tongue. He looked up then and saw where she was staring. His eyes met hers. He didn't flinch, didn't try to hide the scar. His expression remained placid, calm. He simply waited. He was giving her the opening to ask, to satisfy the curiosity that he had to know was burning in her. And, in that moment, Clara made another choice. She remembered the cold, dismissive look in Caleb Rourke's eyes, the prying stares of the townsfolk, the shame of being judged for a life that was not her own. This man, Sawyer Bell, had not asked her a single question about her past. He had not asked why she was alone, or where she came from, or why the most respectable man in town had turned her away. He had simply seen her in. She would grant him the same courtesy, slowly, deliberately. She lowered her eyes from the scar and took a sip of her tea. She let the heat of it spread through her chest. When she looked up again, she met his gaze squarely, her own eyes clear of questions. It was a silent pact, a mutual agreement to let the past lie, to accept the person sitting across the table without demanding an accounting of their wounds. A flicker of something surprised relief respect passed through his eyes. He gave a slow, small nod, and took a drink from his own mug. The wind howled outside the sturdy walls of the small cabin, but inside, a profound and peaceful quiet had settled between them, warmer and more welcome than even the fire. Clara awoke to a world of absolute silence. The wind had exhausted itself, leaving a profound stillness in its wake. A pale, watery morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, illuminating a room transformed, last night, in the flickering lantern and firelight. It had been a refuge of shadows and warmth. Now, in the clear light of dawn, it was simply a room, a clean, orderly space that was unapologetically masculine. A rifle rested on a wooden rack above the door. A set of well-cared-for leatherworking tools was arranged neatly on a bench in the corner. There was no clutter, no decoration, nothing that did not serve a purpose. She was lying on a narrow but comfortable cot, tucked under a thick wool blanket that smelled of wood smoke and cedar. Her coat and shawl were draped neatly over a chair. Across the room, Sawyer Bell was already awake. tending to the fire in the stove. He moved with the same quiet efficiency she had noted before, his large frame making no unnecessary sound on the wooden floorboards. He hadn't built a roaring blaze, just a small, steady fire that produced a consistent, pleasant warmth. She sat up, her joints stiff from the cold and the unaccustomed labor of the previous days. He must have heard the rustle of the blanket, because he turned his head. "Morning," he said. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet room. "Good morning," she replied, her own voice feeling small and unused. "The storm has passed." "For now," he said, his gaze flicking to the window. "The sky's clear. It'll be a cold day." He straightened up from the stove and turned to face her fully. "There's coffee." He poured a black, steaming stream of it into one of the tin mugs and handed it to her. She took it, her fingers wrapping around the welcome heat. Their hands did not touch, but for a moment they were close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. It was a simple, courteous gesture, yet it felt intensely personal in the quiet intimacy of the cabin. They drank their coffee in the same comfortable silence they had shared the night before. Clara's mind, usually a whirlwind of anxieties and forward planning, felt strangely calm. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't actively bracing for the next blow, the next judgment, the next disappointment. The cabin, with its sturdy walls and its quiet occupant, felt like a pause in the relentless battle of her life. As the light grew stronger, she noticed the shirt he was wearing. It was a simple homespun cotton garment, washed so many times it had softened to the color of oatmeal, and there was a long, L-shaped tear in the sleeve, starting at the elbow and running down the forearm. The edges were frayed, a testament to some sharp snag on a branch or a piece of equipment. It was a wound in the fabric that mirrored the scar on his skin. He followed her gaze to his arm and gave a slight, self-deprecating shrug. "Met a stubborn branch yesterday," he said. "I'm better at splitting logs than I am at mending tears." Clara looked at his hands. They were large, strong, and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with wood and iron and earth. She could not imagine them holding something as delicate as a sewing needle. "I am not," she said softly. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "I am not better at splitting logs," she clarified, "but I am better at mending tears." She set her mug down on the small table. "If you have a needle and thread, I could fix that for you, as a small thank you for the fire." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. It was as if the idea of someone doing something for him, some small, domestic act of care, was a foreign concept. He hesitated for a moment, then gave a single nod and went to a small wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He rummaged inside and produced a small, battered tin. It contained a few mismatched buttons, a tangle of thick, dark thread, and 2 rust-pocked needles. It was a bachelor's mending kit, a tool of last resort. Clara took the tin from him, her fingers brushing his. "This will do," she said. He took off the shirt, revealing a plain set of woolen underclothes beneath. He handed it to her without any hint of self-consciousness. The fabric was warm from his body. She sat in the chair by the window, where the light was best, and laid the shirt across her lap. She selected the better of the 2 needles, threaded it with a practiced, steady hand, and began to work. Her needle flew, quick and sure. The small, even stitches she made were a language she had spoken her entire life. This was her skill, her art, the one piece of her past that she could claim with pride. She had learned from her mother, not the flamboyant stage performer, but the quiet, sad woman who had spent countless hours between shows mending costumes, her fingers just as deft with a needle as they were with a deck of cards. For Clara, sewing was more than a trade. It was a meditation. Each stitch was a tiny anchor holding the world together. Sawyer sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, but she knew he was watching her. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was filled with the tiny, rhythmic sounds of her work, the whisper of the thread pulling through the cotton, the faint prick of the needle. He finished with his rifle and just sat, his hands resting on the table, observing her with that same quiet intensity she had first felt across the dusty street. She finished the first line of the tear and was starting on the second when he spoke, his voice so quiet it was almost part of the silence. "I used to believe," he said, his gaze fixed on her hands, on the needle dancing in her fingers, "that no one would ever sit in this house with me and not be afraid." Clara's hands stilled. The needle paused mid-stitch. The words dropped into the quiet room with the weight of stones. It was a confession, stark and unadorned. It was the truth of his life, of the isolation he inhabited as surely as he inhabited this cabin. He wasn't looking for pity or absolution. He was simply stating a fact, a belief that had been forged in the fire of his past and hardened over years of solitude. He was confirming the whispers of the miners, acknowledging the fear he saw in the eyes of the townsfolk, the fear he had expected to see in hers. She thought of his scar. She thought of the rifle now resting against the wall. She thought of the rumors, *killed men. A shiver of something not fear, but a profound and sorrowful understanding ran through her. He had lived with that fear, seen it reflected back at him every day, until he had come to believe it was the only way anyone could ever see him. He had accepted his role as the monster at the edge of town. She looked at him, truly looked at him, sitting in the morning light of his own home, and she was not afraid. She felt a kinship with his loneliness that was so powerful it ached. His prison was made of fear. Hers was made of shame. The walls were different, but the solitude was the same. She took a deep, steadying breath and pushed the needle through the cloth, completing the stitch. Her voice, when she spoke, was as quiet and steady as his had been. "I used to believe," she said, her eyes meeting his across the small space, "that no one would ever look at me without seeing shame." His gaze sharpened. He had laid his own wound bare, and she had just shown him hers, a wound just as deep, just as defining. In her words, he heard the echo of his own isolation. She was the woman rejected on the train platform, the woman with a sullied heritage, the woman who walked through town with her back straight and her eyes downcast, wrapped in a silence that was its own kind of armor. He had seen her strength, but now he understood its source, a lifetime of bearing a shame that was not of her own making. The air in the room shifted. A delicate, unspoken thing had been exchanged between them, a currency of trust more valuable than gold. He had offered her his deepest truth, and she had met it with her own. There were no more shadows between them. He was the feared man. She was the shamed woman. And in this small, quiet room, none of it mattered. A small, fragile peace began to settle in Clara's heart. It was a feeling so foreign she could barely name it. It was not happiness, not joy, but something quieter, more fundamental. It was the simple, profound relief of being seen. He did not see her mother's ghost, and she did not see a killer's past. They saw each other, two lonely people, sitting in a pool of morning light, who had found in one another a place where they did not have to hide. She finished her work, knotted the thread, and snipped it with a small pair of scissors from the tin. The tear was gone, replaced by a neat, strong seam that would hold for years. She held the shirt out to him. "There," she said, "it's done." He took it from her, his fingers brushing hers. He looked at the seam, then at her. For the first time, she saw the faintest hint of a smile touch the corners of his mouth. It was a small, rare thing, and it transformed his hard face completely. "Thank you, Clara," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was the most welcome thing she had ever heard. The small piece Clara found in Sawyer Bell's cabin was a secret garden in the middle of a barren desert. It was a place she tended to with quiet reverence, a sanctuary she walked to in the pre-dawn darkness and departed from as dusk settled its purple cloak over the land. In the world of his cabin, she was simply Clara. She was a woman who could mend a shirt, who enjoyed the taste of strong coffee, whose quiet presence was not questioned but simply accepted. They spoke, but not often of the past. Instead, they talked of the practicalities of the present, the best way to bank a fire, the signs of a coming snow, the taste of the venison stew he cooked. Their companionship was a thing built of shared silences and small, useful actions. It was a language of mutual respect, spoken without the need for grand declarations. But the moment she stepped out of the tree line and back into the orbit of Dustmere, she ceased to be Clara and became, once again, a story the town told itself, and the story was changing. She was no longer just the spurned mail-order bride. Now, she was a mystery, a whisper, a source of endless, prurient speculation. Her comings and goings did not go unnoticed. A woman leaving a boarding house before the sun was up and returning after it had set, day after day, was an affront to the town's rigid order. Curtains twitched as she passed. The women, who had once offered her a cool but civil distance, now averted their eyes entirely, gathering their children closer as if Clara's independence were a communicable disease. The men were different. Their stares were no longer merely curious. They were laced with a coarse, knowing familiarity. They looked at her as if they knew exactly where she had been and what she'd been doing, their smirks painting a vulgar picture that bore no resemblance to the quiet reality of her days with Sawyer. She walked through their silent accusations with her head held high, her face a mask of serene indifference. She had learned long ago that to show hurt was to give the world a weapon to use against you. But the weight of their judgment was a physical burden, a cloak of ice that settled on her shoulders the moment she left the woods and did not lift until she returned. One afternoon, as she was helping Millie fold a fresh batch of laundry in the kitchen, the older woman paused, her chapped hands stilling on a crisp white sheet. Her slate-gray eyes, which missed nothing, were fixed on Clara's face. "You're spending your days with him. Then," Millie stated. It was not a question. Clara's hands also stilled. She met Millie's gaze without flinching. Yes. Millie folded a corner of the sheet with a sharp, decisive snap. "Sawyer Bell is a good man. In his way, he's honest. He pays his debts. He keeps to himself, which is more than I can say for most in this town." She paused, her gaze hardening with a wisdom that was as old and unforgiving as the landscape. "But that doesn't matter to them." She jerked her chin toward the window, toward the town beyond. All they see is a man with a dark past and a woman with no clear place, and they will grind you between those two stones until there's nothing left. "I am doing nothing wrong," Clara said, her voice low but firm. "Wrong has nothing to do with it," Millie retorted, her voice dropping. "This is about order, about what they understand. They understand a woman who is a wife, a mother, or a widow. They understand a woman who works in a shop or a kitchen, under the eye of a respectable employer." Her eyes locked onto Clara's. "They do not understand a woman who makes her own choices. Be careful. Clara, Dustmere isn't kind to women like that. It will try to break you, or it will try to put you in a box you fit in." Millie's warning proved prophetic less than a week later. Clara was scrubbing the front porch steps when a polished black buggy, the only one of its kind in town, pulled up in front of the boarding house. The man who stepped down was Mayor Augustus Thompson. He was a portly man with a florid face, a carefully trimmed mustache, and a gold watch chain stretched across his considerable waistcoat. He radiated an aura of self-importance that seemed to suck the very air around him. He tipped his hat to Clara, a gesture that was more condescending than courteous. "Miss Whitmore," he boomed, his voice overly cheerful. "Just the person I was hoping to see." Clara rose slowly, wiping her wet hands on her apron. She had seen him from a distance, but this was the first time he had addressed her, "Mr. Mayor." She said, her tone even. "I have come on a matter of some delicacy," he said, smiling a smile that did not reach his eyes. "My wife, Beatrice, is in need of a new gown for the upcoming Thanksgiving social. A rather fine piece of silk arrived on the last provision wagon, and word has reached us why. The whole town is buzzing with it of your exceptional skill with a needle and thread." Clara stood perfectly still. This was not a simple offer of work. It was a summons. It was the town's highest authority extending a hand, not to her, but to her skill. The ladies of the church auxiliary were most impressed with the repairs you made to the altar cloths. He continued, his tone smooth as butter. My wife feels it is our civic duty, as the town's leading family, to patronize local talent. She would be honored if you would consent to creating her gown. It was, as Millie had predicted, an attempt to put her in a box. The box was labeled seamstress. It was a respectable box, a useful box. To accept was to be granted a form of provisional citizenship in the town society. To refuse would be an insult, an act of defiance that would slam the door on any hope of a peaceful existence. I would be happy to assist Mrs. Thompson, Clara said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. Excellent, excellent, the mayor boomed. Beatrice is expecting you. This afternoon, at 2 o'clock. Our home is the White House with the green shutters, at the opposite end of town. You can't miss it. He tipped his hat again, climbed back into his buggy, and rode off, leaving Clara on the porch with the smell of horsehide and the cold, hard reality of her new commission. The Thompson residence was everything the boarding house was not. Where Millie's was weathered and practical, the mayor's house was pristine and ornamental. The white paint was fresh, the green shutters immaculate, the windows so clean they seemed to disappear, a neatly tended, though now dormant, flower garden sat behind a fastidiously painted white picket fence. It was a house that stood as a monument to its owner's prosperity and importance. A young serving girl with a frightened expression showed Clara into the parlor. The room was a shrine to Victorian propriety, filled with heavy, dark furniture, thick velvet curtains that blocked out the harsh western sun, and countless knickknacks that served no purpose other than to collect dust. It was a room designed to impress and to suffocate. Beatrice Thompson entered a moment later. She was a thin, severe woman whose face seemed to be locked in a permanent state of mild disapproval. She was dressed in a gown of expensive, dark taffeta that rustled with every movement. Her hair was swept up in an elaborate style that must have taken an hour to construct. She was the queen of this small, dusty kingdom, and her cold blue eyes surveyed Clara as if she were a tradesperson of questionable hygiene. "Miss Whitmore," she said, her voice as crisp and cool as a winter morning. "Thank you for coming." She did not offer Clara a seat. Instead, she gestured to a roll of shimmering blue silk lying on a settee. "This is the fabric. I have a design in mind from Godey's Lady's Book Asterisk. I trust you are familiar with it." "I am, ma'am," Clara said. For the next hour, Clara was subjected to a litany of precise, demanding instructions. Beatrice Thompson described in exhausting detail the cut of the bodice, the number of pleats in the skirt, the style of the sleeves. Clara listened, nodded, and took careful measurements, her professionalism a shield against the woman's condescending tone. "Mrs." Thompson spoke of Clara's skill as if it were a surprising but useful abnormality, like a horse that could count. Finally, the measurements were taken and the instructions given. Clara carefully rolled the precious silk, her mind already working through the technical challenges of the design. The Thanksgiving social is a most important event for the town. "Mrs." Thompson said, her voice taking on a new, harder edge as Clara prepared to leave. "It is a time for us to come together as a community and reaffirm our shared values: decency, order, propriety." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Your presence in Dustmere has been a subject of some discussion." Clara's hands tightened on the roll of fabric. She met the older woman's gaze. "I am a quiet resident. Ma'am, I work hard and trouble no one." A thin, dismissive smile touched Beatrice Thompson's lips. "Your association with a man like Sawyer Bell is troubling to many. He is not a part of our community. He is an outsider, with a history I am sure you can imagine." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a confidential, conspiratorial whisper that was more venomous than a shout. A woman's reputation is her only true currency. Once squandered, it can never be regained. You are a skilled needlewoman. Miss Whitmore, that is a respectable and useful attribute. She let her cold blue eyes travel from Clara's face down to her work-roughened hands. The meaning was clear. Her skill was acceptable. The woman holding the needle was not. This commission is an opportunity for you, Beatrice continued, her voice regaining its formal tone. An opportunity to demonstrate that you understand the ways of a civilized town. She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on her taffeta skirt. You should know your place, Miss Whitmore. Fulfill your duties quietly and well, and you will find your life here much more pleasant. Clara stood in the opulent, suffocating parlor, the beautiful silk in her arms feeling suddenly as heavy as lead. The message had been delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Asterisk. You are welcome here only as long as you are useful, and only as long as you conform. You are our project, our charity. Step out of line, and this conditional acceptance will be revoked. I understand completely, Mrs. Thompson, Clara said, her voice a perfect, cool monotone. She turned and walked out of the pristine White House, leaving the Queen of Dustmere to her velvet curtains and her rigid rules. The cold afternoon sun felt harsh on her face. She had been given her chance to be part of the town, but the price was to erase herself, to sever the one true and honest connection she had found. The box Millie had warned her about had been offered, and its lid was open, waiting. The work on Mrs. Thompson's gown became Clara's refuge, in the quiet of her small room at Millie's. She could lose herself in the geography of the shimmering blue silk, the precise geometry of the pattern, the steady rhythm of her needle, the transformation of a flat piece of cloth into a thing of structure and beauty. It was a world she could control. It was a world where her skill was the only thing that mattered, where the whispers and stares of Dustmere could not penetrate. She had to make a trip to Rourke's Mercantile to purchase a specific kind of thread, a fine, strong silk cord for the corsetry. The thought of entering Caleb Rourke's establishment was a bitter pill to swallow, but the gown required it. She chose a time in the middle of the day, hoping the shop would be quiet, holding the list from Mrs. Thompson like a shield. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The store was a cluttered cavern of scents: coffee beans, cured leather, pickling spices, and dry wool. Caleb was behind the counter, measuring out flour for another customer. He saw her enter, and a flicker of deep, uncomfortable red rose up his neck and disappeared into his beard. He immediately became engrossed in his task. Refusing to meet her eyes, Clara ignored him, moving to the small notions counter where the threads and ribbons were kept. She found what she needed and waited, her back straight, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. The bell above the door jingled again. A man entered, stamping the dust from his boots with unnecessary vigor. He was a thick-set man with a florid, pock-marked face and a swagger that seemed too large for the cramped store. Clara paid him no mind. Her attention focused solely on completing her transaction and leaving. "Well, I'll be," a loud, unpleasantly familiar voice boomed, cutting through the quiet of the store. "Clara Jane Whitmore, of all the godforsaken dust piles to find you in." Clara froze. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. She did not have to turn around to know who it was. Silas Croft, a freight driver who had sometimes boarded at the same house as she had in St. Joseph. A man with a cruel mouth and hands that were always too ready to linger on a woman's arm. Slowly, she turned. He was grinning at her, a wide, predatory smile that showed a row of tobacco-stained teeth. "Last I saw you, you were sewing hats for the fine ladies of St. Joseph," he said, his voice loud enough for Caleb and the other two customers to hear every word. "Though, as I recall, your mother's talents were more theatrical, a real performer. She knew how to please a crowd." The insinuation was as vile as it was obvious. The air in the store grew thick and still. Caleb fumbled with his flour scoop. The other customers suddenly found the contents of a pickle barrel intensely fascinating. This was the ghost she had been running from her entire life, now standing before her in the flesh, gleefully tearing open her oldest wounds for the town's entertainment. "Hello, Silas," she said, her voice a thin, brittle thing. "You'll have to excuse me. I'm in a hurry." "Oh, not so fast," he said, taking a step to block her path to the counter. "What's a pretty little thing like you doing all the way out here? Following in the family tradition, I hear the saloon in this town is always looking for fresh talent." He winked at the other men in the store, inviting them to share in his cruel joke. Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over Clara. This was her nightmare realized. To be exposed, to be publicly branded with the very reputation she had fought so hard to escape. She could feel the weight of every stare, every smirk, every silent judgment. Her first instinct was to flee, to run from the store, from the town, from this life. But then she thought of Sawyer. She thought of his quiet strength, of his unflinching acceptance. She thought of the small peace she had found. She would not let this loud, oafish man destroy it. She squared her shoulders and met his gaze, her own eyes cold as ice. "I am here as a seamstress for Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its former strength. "Now, if you will step aside." Her defiance only seemed to amuse him. "Mrs. Thompson, is it moving up in the world? Are we or just aiming for a wealthier class of patron?" He chuckled, a low, nasty sound. "Don't you worry, your secrets are safe with me." "For a price." He took another step toward her, his intentions sickeningly clear. The world narrowed to his leering face, the smell of cheap whiskey on his breath. Clara braced herself, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. The bell on the door jingled again, a soft, almost imperceptible sound in the charged atmosphere. No one had noticed him enter. Sawyer Bell did not announce his presence with noise or bluster. He simply was. One moment, the space behind Silas Croft had been empty. The next, it was filled by his tall, solid frame. He stood there, just inside the doorway, his hat pulled low, his face in shadow. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at Clara. He took in her pale, rigid face, her clenched hands, and the desperate, defiant terror in her eyes. And in that one long, silent look, he understood everything. The shift in the room was immediate and absolute. The nervous energy curdled into outright fear. Caleb Rourke froze completely, a statue made of flour dust. Silas, feeling the sudden chill in the air, turned. His blustering grin faltered when he saw who was standing behind him. He was a head shorter than Sawyer, and where Silas was fleshy. Sawyer was hard lines and muscle. The rumors about the man in the doorway, stories told in hushed tones in every saloon and bunkhouse in the territory, were suddenly very real. Sawyer took one slow, deliberate step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He simply moved into the space between Silas and Clara, becoming a silent, immovable wall. He still didn't look at Silas. His gaze remained on Clara, a silent reassurance. Then, slowly, he turned his head, and his eyes, cold and dark as a winter river, finally fell upon Silas Croft. The silence stretched, thin and tight as a wire. Sawyer's voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that was more menacing than any shout. "She's not running," he said. The simple statement hung in the air. It was an observation, but it was also a verdict. He had seen Clara stand her ground, had seen her refuse to be broken. Silas swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating under that relentless, unblinking stare. He tried to rally, to puff out his chest. "Now, see here, Belle, this is none of your affair. This is between me and the little lady." Sawyer cut him off, his voice dropping even lower, the words precise and sharp as newly honed steel. "Are you?" The question stopped Silas cold. She's not running. Are you asterisk? It was a challenge, a mirror held up to his own bullying cowardice. It laid him bare for everyone to see a man who got his strength from trying to shame a lone woman. Now faced with a man who held his ground without a single threat, the unspoken promise of violence was there, of course, coiled and waiting behind Sawyer's stillness, but the wound he had inflicted was one of pride. Silas's face paled. He looked from Sawyer's implacable expression to the suddenly hostile faces of the other men in the store, who now saw him not as an entertainer, but as a cornered rat. He had lost his audience. He had lost his nerve. "I've got no business here," he stammered, taking a clumsy step backward. "Just leaving." He practically scrambled out of the store, the bell on the door clanging wildly in his wake. The tension in the store broke, but the silence that followed was heavy with new questions. Caleb Rourke, his face ashen, finally found his voice. That'll be 10 cents for the thread. Miss Whitmore," he stuttered. Clara moved to the counter as if in a dream. Her hands were shaking. She paid for the thread, took her small package, and turned. Sawyer was still standing by the door, watching her. The eyes of everyone in the store darted between them, a silent, frantic exchange of speculation. She walked toward him, toward the door. As she drew level, she stopped and looked up at him. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He held the door for her, and she stepped out into the harsh afternoon sunlight. He followed a moment later, the door swinging shut behind them, leaving the whispers to begin in their absence. They stood on the dusty boardwalk, a silent, isolated island in the middle of the street. Clara knew that every eye in every window was on them now. What Sawyer had done, he had done for her, but he had also done it in front of the entire town. He had publicly, unequivocally, taken her side. He had drawn a line in the dust, placing her on his side of it, and the rest of Dustmere on the other. The gossip had been a vague, insidious cloud before. Now, it would have a name and a shape. The question was no longer asterisk who asterisk she was, or even what she might have done in her past. The only question Dustmere would ask itself now, in hushed and fearful tones, was the one that hung in the air between the mercantile and the saloon, the church and the boarding house. What is she to him? The walk from the mercantile was a silent, agonizing journey through a gauntlet of stairs. Before, the looks had been speculative, curious. Now, they were different. They were possessive. Sawyer Bell had claimed something in that store, and the town was now watching his prize. Clara felt like a stray dog he had collared, a piece of property whose ownership was now a matter of public record. She could feel the story being written, etched into the dusty air by 100 pairs of eyes, the dangerous outcast and his mysterious woman. She walked with her head high, her gaze fixed on the horizon, but every muscle in her body was screaming. Her hands, clutching the small parcel of thread, were slick with a cold sweat. She did not look at the man walking beside her. His presence, which had once felt like a quiet comfort, was now a roaring fire that drew every eye, a beacon that illuminated her in the very way she had spent her life trying to avoid. He matched her pace, his long strides shortened to accommodate hers. He was a silent shadow at her side, seemingly oblivious to the storm of attention they were creating. Or perhaps, she thought with a surge of bitter resentment, he was simply used to it. Perhaps he had lived so long as the town's boogeyman that he no longer even noticed the fear and suspicion that followed him like his own shadow. They did not speak. There were no words for the space between them now, a chasm that had been blasted open in the middle of Rourke's mercantile. When they reached the edge of town, where the path diverged one way leading to Millie's, the other to the woods, she did not pause. She turned toward the trees, her steps quick and angry. The confrontation that was brewing inside her could not happen under Millie's roof, under the weight of her knowing, pitying gaze. It had to happen in his space, the place where this new, unbearable reality had been forged. He followed her, his silence a heavy weight at her back. The moment the cabin door shut behind them, the silence broke. The lock, clicking into place, was like a starting pistol. Clara spun around, her carefully constructed composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice a low, trembling wire of fury. The parcel of thread fell from her numb fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. Sawyer stood by the door, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He took off his hat, his movements slow and deliberate. "I stopped a man from insulting you." "You stopped him!" she cried, her voice rising with a frantic, incredulous energy. "You think that's what you did? You did not stop him. You confirmed him. You confirmed every vile, rotten thing he was implying. Every whisper this town has ever had about me." She began to pace the small space, a caged animal in a trap of his making. "I had a life here. It wasn't much. It was quiet. I was the seamstress. I was the woman who kept to herself. I was invisible. It was a miserable sort of peace, but it was peace. And you, with your silent threats and your reputation, you strode in and you blew it all to hell." He watched her, his face calm, but a deep line of confusion creased his brow. "Clara, he was threatening you." "And I was handling him," she shot back, whirling to face him. "I have been handling men like Silas Croft my entire life. I have learned to make myself small, to be polite, to swallow the shame and walk away. That is how I have survived. You don't survive by making a scene. You don't survive by having the town's most feared man step in front of you like a champion. All you did was paint a target on my back. You took my invisibility and you set it on fire." The injustice of it all, the sheer, helpless rage, was a physical thing, choking her. Tears of frustration, hot and sharp, pricked at the back of her eyes, and she hated herself for the weakness. "Do you have any idea what they are saying out there right now?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "They are not saying, 'That brave Sawyer Bell defended a lady's honor.' They are saying, 'So that's what she is to him.' They are looking at me and seeing a possession, your possession, a woman who belongs to the man who lives in the woods and kills people for money. You haven't saved my reputation. You have given me yours." He remained silent, absorbing her tirade. He was not a man of many words, and he seemed to be searching for the right ones now, turning them over in his mind before speaking. He took a step toward her, his hands held open at his sides, a gesture of peace. "What would you have had me do?" he asked, his voice a low, reasonable rumble. "Stand by and watch him corner you." Yes, the word was a raw cry, torn from the deepest part of her. Yes, because I could have walked away from him. I could have borne his insults, and in a day, he would be gone, and I would still be the quiet seamstress. Now, I don't know what I am. I am a spectacle. I am your woman. I am something to be whispered about behind cupped hands at the mercantile. You took my quiet, miserable little box and you smashed it, and now I have nowhere to stand at all." She finally stopped pacing and stood in the middle of the room, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold the pieces of her shattered composure together. The anger was draining away, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. The silence returned, filled now with the echo of her angry words and the ragged sound of her breathing. Sawyer looked at her, and, for the first time, she saw a flicker of profound understanding in his eyes. He wasn't looking at her anger anymore. He was looking beneath it, at the raw, terrified thing she had been trying to protect. He saw the fortress she had built around herself, the one he had just breached without ever meaning to. He spoke again, and his voice was different. It was softer, stripped of all defense, holding a question that was more an observation. "How long have you lived like that? Clara," he asked, "hiding, making yourself small. How long have you lived without letting anyone truly see you?" He took another slow step toward her, his eyes holding hers. "Aren't you tired?" The question hit her with the force of a physical blow. "Aren't you tired, The anger, the fear, the carefully constructed walls of her life, it all dissolved in the face of those 4 simple words. Tired. It was a word she had never allowed herself to feel, a luxury she could not afford. But now, the truth of it washed over her, an immense, crushing wave. She was tired. She was bone-weary and soul-deep tired of the constant vigilance, of the performance of propriety, of the endless, lonely battle to be seen as anything other than her mother's daughter. She was tired of being invisible, and she was terrified of being seen. The fight went out of her, leaving her utterly limp. The tears she had been holding back now streamed freely down her face, silent trails of a lifetime of exhaustion. She did not bother to wipe them away. What was the point? He had already seen everything. She looked around the cabin, at its sturdy walls, at the fire glowing in the stove, at the man standing before her. It had been a sanctuary, a place of peace. Now it felt like a cage. The town was a cage of judgment, and this cabin was a cage of a different kind, one defined by his protection, his choices, his world. Neither was a place she could call her own. She was adrift, a boat without a harbor, without an anchor. She backed away from him, a slow step, then another, until her back was pressed against the rough-hewn wood of the doorframe. She was standing on the threshold, neither in nor out. It was the story of her life. "I don't belong here," she whispered, the words a raw admission of her deepest fear. She didn't just mean the cabin. She meant Dustmere. She meant anywhere. Sawyer did not move toward her. He stood his ground in the center of the room, a fixed point in her spinning world. He looked at her, standing there broken in his doorway, and his face was filled with a fierce, quiet intensity. "You belong anywhere you can walk into without asking permission," he said, his voice low and steady and certain. It was not a comfort. It was a creed. A place isn't something you're given. It's something you make. It's the ground you decide to stand on. He held her gaze, and she felt the power of his words settle deep within her. He was offering her something she had never conceived of, a new way of seeing the world, not as a series of doors that might be opened or slammed in her face, but as an open space waiting for her to claim a piece of it. He took a small, deliberate breath. "If you haven't found that place yet," he said, his voice dropping even lower, softer, an invitation that was as solid and real as the floorboards beneath her feet. "You can start right here." Sawyer's words hung in the doorway, a promise of a foundation in a world that had always been shifting sand beneath Clara's feet. She did not step in, but she did not step away. She remained on that threshold for a long moment, caught between the life she had always known and a future she could not begin to imagine. In the end, she gave a slow, tired nod, a truce with her own fear. She spent the day at his cabin, mending the rest of his worn work clothes while he split a mountain of firewood, the steady, rhythmic asterisk, thunk asterisk of his axe, a comforting percussion to the silence. They did not speak of the incident at the Mercantile again. They did not need to. The battle had been fought, and the ground had shifted. She returned to Millie's at dusk, the blue silk for Mrs. Thompson's gown clutched in her hand like a passport to a world she no longer felt a part of. The change in the weather began subtly the next day. A strange, metallic cast appeared in the sky, and the relentless wind died down, leaving an unnerving, expectant stillness. Sawyer, who had come into town for salt and flour, stopped by the boarding house porch where Clara was shaking out rugs. "Sky looks heavy," he said, his gaze fixed on the bruised purple line of the western horizon, "and the air smells of snow. A lot of it." By evening, his prediction began to come true. The first flakes drifted down, large and lazy, melting as they touched the red dust, but they were soon followed by more, smaller and harder, driven by a rising wind. By the time the boarders sat down for supper, the world outside the windows was a swirling vortex of white. The wind, which had been a whisper, rose to a moan, then a shriek, rattling the window frames and finding every crack in the old house's walls. This was no ordinary winter squall. This was a blizzard, a white monster descending from the mountains with the intent to devour the world. The first sign of real trouble came just after midnight. A series of loud cracks, like pistol shots, echoed from the east end of town, followed by a low, groaning roar. Millie, who had been dozing in a chair by the fire, was on her feet in an instant. "That's the roof of the old tenement," she said, her face grim in the lamplight, "where the new miners and their families are living. The lumber's half rotten." Before anyone could react, the front door burst open, and Sawyer Bell stood there, a hurricane lantern in his hand and a thick layer of snow on his shoulders. He looked not at Millie, but at Clara. "We need to get them out," he said, his voice cutting through the howl of the storm. "The whole row of shacks could go. We'll bring them to the church. It's the only building with a stone foundation big enough to hold everyone." In that moment, the town's fragile social order dissolved. There was no Mayor Thompson giving orders, no sheriff sputtering about procedure. There was only the storm and the clear, practical authority in Sawyer's voice. The two miners, Jeb and Al, who had once traded whispers about him, now looked at him with a kind of desperate hope. "What do you need?" Bell Jeb asked, already pulling on his coat. "Rope," Sawyer commanded, "and every lantern and blanket you can find. We'll need to string a line from the church to the tenements so no one gets lost in the whiteout." He turned to Millie. "We'll need hot coffee and food, anything you have." Then his eyes found Clara again. His look was not a command, but a question. Clara was already moving. "I'll get the medical supplies," she said, her mind racing. Millie kept a small chest of laudanum, carbolic acid, and linen bandages. It wouldn't be much, but it was a start. The church hall was a scene of controlled chaos. A great fire roared in the stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Sawyer and the other able-bodied men, their faces raw from the wind, began to bring in the refugees. They were a miserable, half-frozen collection of men, women, and children, their eyes wide with fear and cold. They stumbled in, wrapped in threadbare blankets, clutching what few possessions they had been able to grab. The roof of their tenement had not just collapsed, it had pancaked, bringing down two neighboring shacks with it. Several people had injuries, cuts from broken glass, a nasty burn on a young boy's arm from a toppled stove, a woman with a dislocated shoulder. And into this chaos, Clara moved like a calm spirit. The woman who had spent her life trying to be invisible was suddenly at the center of it all. Yet she drew no attention to herself. She simply saw what needed to be done. She cleaned and bandaged a gash on a miner's head, her stitches as neat and efficient as the ones she had put in Sawyer's shirt. When she ran out of linen, she did not hesitate. Tearing long strips from her own petticoats, she set the woman's shoulder with a firm, practiced grip that belied her slender frame, earning a gasp of pain and then a sob of profound relief. The townswomen, who had gathered to help, watched her with a mixture of awe and confusion. Even Beatrice Thompson was there, having been roused by her husband. She stood near the back, a useless, ornamental figure in a fine wool coat, wringing her hands and offering impractical advice. Someone should really send for the doctor, she fretted, ignoring the fact that the doctor was 50 miles away in the next county, on the other side of an impassable blizzard. But the other women, the blacksmith's wife, the baker's daughter, women who had shunned Clara in the street now found themselves taking direction from her. She didn't order them. She simply spoke with a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. "We need to get these wet clothes off the children," she'd say softly, and two women would rush to help. "This man needs hot broth. He's going into shock," and a cup would be pressed into her hand. Her skills, born of a hard life, were now invaluable. She knew the signs of frostbite, knew how to coax a shivering child into drinking something warm, knew how to mend a torn coat with a few quick stitches so it could be of use again. They had scorned her for her past, for her association with Sawyer Bell, for her refusal to fit into their neat little boxes. Now, in the heart of the storm. They clung to her calm competence. Her silence, which they had mistaken for shame, was revealed to be a deep well of strength. She did not complain, she did not falter, she did not gossip or wring her hands. She simply worked. And through it all, Sawyer was a constant, steady presence at the periphery. He was the anchor of the entire operation. He organized the men, sending them back out into the storm to check on other vulnerable structures, to bring in more firewood, to rescue livestock trapped in a collapsing barn. His knowledge of the land and of simple, practical engineering was saving lives. He moved through the crowded hall, a quiet giant, his face grim with the weight of responsibility. He did not praise Clara. He did not speak to her unless necessary. But his support was a tangible thing. When the fire by her makeshift infirmary began to die down, a fresh load of wood would appear silently at her side. When she was so focused on setting a broken finger that she forgot the world around her, a tin mug of hot, sweet coffee would be placed in her hand. He stood between her and the chaos, a silent guardian, ensuring she had the space and the resources to do her work. He was the brawn, she was the calm, and together, they were holding the heart of the town together while the storm tried to rip it apart. At one point, she looked up from splinting the arm of a crying child and saw Mayor Thompson watching her. His face, usually so florid and self-satisfied, was pale and humbled. He looked from Clara, her dress stained with soot and a smear of blood, to his own wife, who was rearranging donated blankets into a neater pile, a useless task in the face of such overwhelming need. He caught Clara's eye and gave a slow, grudging nod. It was not friendship. It was not acceptance. It was respect, a currency that, in the midst of the blizzard, was worth more than all the gold in his watch chain. Clara simply nodded back and turned her attention to the child, whose cries were quieting. She didn't need their praise. She didn't need their acceptance. Sawyer's words from the day before echoed in her mind, asterisk. A place isn't something you're given. It's something you make. As the first pale light of dawn struggled to penetrate the swirling snow, she stood and stretched her aching back. The church hall was now quiet, the rescued family sleeping fitfully on pallets on the floor. The storm still raged, but the immediate crisis had passed. She looked around at the makeshift sanctuary, at the faces of the people she had helped. They were the same people who had judged her, who had whispered about her. But something had broken in the storm, something more than just the roofs of their houses. The rigid lines of their small society had been washed away in the flood of white. Sawyer came and stood beside her, looking out over the sleeping room. He was covered in snow and looked utterly exhausted, but his eyes were clear. "You did good work here, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. She looked at the faces of the sleeping children, at the rhythm of their breathing. She looked at her own hands, chapped and sore, but steady. She had not asked for this. She had not wanted to be seen. But in the heart of the storm, she had found her footing. She had made her place not with words or pleas, but with her own 2 hands. She did not reply to him. She just watched the fire. And for the first time since she had arrived in Dustmere, she felt the solid ground beneath her feet. The blizzard broke on the 3rd day, retreating into the mountains as suddenly as it had come. It left behind a world remade, sculpted in brilliant, blinding white. The sky that emerged was a startling, painful blue, and the sun on the snow was so bright it felt like a different star. Dustmere was buried. The single street was a deep trench carved between massive drifts, and the houses wore thick, soft hats of snow that slumped over their eaves. The silence was the most profound change. The wind was gone, and the snow swallowed all sound, creating a deep, muffled peace. But it was the silence of a town holding its breath. For 2 days, the people of Dustmere had been huddled together in the church, their lives stripped down to the barest essentials: warmth, food, and survival. The rigid social lines that had once seemed as permanent as the mountains had dissolved in the face of shared crisis. The banker's wife had shared her blanket with a miner's child. Caleb Rourke had helped haul firewood alongside men he would have barely acknowledged a week before. And at the center of that temporary, fragile community had been Clara and Sawyer. He, the silent outcast, had become their leader, his practical knowledge and calm strength the bedrock on which they had all stood. And she, the shamed woman, had become their healer, her quiet competence and steady hands a balm on their fear. As the town began to dig itself out, a new feeling took root. It was a raw, humbled sense of gratitude. They had survived, they had been tested, and they had not been entirely broken. It was Mayor Thompson, his face looking 10 years older and 100 years wiser, who suggested it. "This year," he announced in the half-cleared space in front of the mercantile, his voice carrying in the crisp air, "Thanksgiving will be more than a formality. It will be a true giving of thanks. We'll hold it in the church hall. Everyone will bring what they can. We will feast not as employers and workers, but as neighbors who have weathered the same storm." The idea was met with a murmur of solemn approval. In the days that followed, a new kind of work began. The men focused on rebuilding, their hammers ringing out in the cold air as they repaired the damaged tenements. The women focused on the feast, pooling their scant resources, their conversations in the mercantile no longer about gossip, but about recipes for pumpkin pie and the best way to roast a wild turkey. Clara, too, was busy. She finished Mrs. Thompson's blue silk gown, the shimmering fabric a relic from another world, a world before the storm. When she delivered it, Beatrice Thompson was uncharacteristically subdued. She accepted the gown with a curt nod, her thin lips pressed into a line that was not quite a smile, but no longer a sneer. "The workmanship is excellent, Miss Whitmore," was all she said. The grudging respect was a more profound victory for Clara than a flood of effusive praise would have been. With that commission done, Clara turned to a new project. For herself, she used the money she had earned to buy a length of simple wool from Rourke's mercantile, the color of a deep forest shadow, and in the quiet evenings in her room, by the light of a single lamp, she began to sew. This dress was different. It was not designed to impress or to conform. The lines were simple, clean, and elegant. It was a dress made not for a seamstress, or a fallen woman, or a mystery, but for Clara. Each stitch was a quiet declaration of the woman she was becoming, the one who stood on her own 2 feet. On the evening of the Thanksgiving social, she dressed with care. The dark green wool fit her perfectly, its modest cut accentuating the strength in her shoulders and the straightness of her spine. She pinned her dark hair up simply, letting a few errant curls frame her face. When she looked in the small, warped mirror in her room, the woman who looked back was a stranger, and yet more herself than she had ever been. The fear was still there, a faint tremor deep inside, but it was no longer in her eyes. She walked to the church alone. The air was frigid and sharp, and the stars in the black sky seemed close enough to touch. The windows of the church hall glowed with a warm, inviting light, spilling out onto the snow. The sound of voices and the clatter of plates was a low, pleasant hum. She paused at the door, her hand on the cold iron latch, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment. The old Clara would have slipped in through a side door, her head bowed, her eyes on the floor, hoping not to be noticed. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and walked in. The room fell silent, not in the hostile, judgmental way it once had, but in a wave of sudden, focused attention. The hall was crowded, warm, and smelled of roasted meat and wood smoke. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a soft, golden glow. At the long trestle tables, people turned on their benches to look at her. She did not falter. Her gaze swept across the room, meeting their eyes directly. She saw the miner whose head she had stitched. He raised his cup to her in a silent toast. She saw the young woman whose shoulder she had set, who gave her a small, shy smile. She saw Jeb and Al, who nodded to her with open respect. She even saw Caleb Rourke, who looked down at his plate, his face flushed with a shame that was now entirely his own. She was no longer an outsider to be judged. She was a part of their story, a part of the storm they had all survived. And then she saw Sawyer. He was standing near the great stone hearth, a tin cup of coffee in his hand. He had been watching the door. He had been waiting for her. He wore a clean shirt, and his dark hair was combed back from his face. As she stood there, holding the gaze of the entire town, his eyes met hers across the room, and in them, she saw a fierce, quiet pride that was more warming than the fire at his back. She began to move toward him, her steps even and unhurried. The crowd shifted, a silent parting of the waters to let her pass. She felt as though she were walking on a stage, but for the first time in her life, she was not playing a part. She reached his side, and the murmur of conversation in the room slowly resumed. A quiet acknowledgement that the moment had passed, that a new order had been established. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Sawyer," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. They stood together by the fire, a comfortable island of silence in the gentle sea of noise. They did not need to speak. After a while, a man with a fiddle began to play a lively, foot-stomping tune, and a few of the younger couples began a clumsy, laughing reel in the center of the floor. Sawyer watched them for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he set his cup down on the mantelpiece and turned to her. He held out his hand. It was his left hand, the one unmarred by the scars of his work. Clara looked from his outstretched hand to his face. A question was in her eyes. "I'm not much of a dancer," he said, his voice so low she had to lean in slightly to hear him over the fiddle. His gaze was direct, unwavering, and held a vulnerability she had never seen there before. "Never learned how, but if you'll teach me, I'll learn." Her breath caught in her throat. He was not asking her to join the boisterous reel. He was asking for something else entirely. In front of this entire town, the man who had never asked for anything, who had lived his life in a fortress of solitude, was asking her to meet him in the open. She placed her hand in his. His skin was warm and rough, his grip firm and gentle. He led her to the center of the floor. The fiddler, seeing them, faltered and then let his bow fall silent. The other dancers shuffled to a halt, moving back to the edges of the room. A profound, watchful quiet fell over the church hall. Sawyer placed his other hand gently on her waist. She rested her free hand on his shoulder. They stood there for a beat, a silent, solitary couple in the middle of the worn floorboards, bathed in the golden light of the lanterns. There was no music. There was no one to follow, no steps to guide them. Then, slowly, he began to move. It was not a dance. It was a simple, shuffling turn, a slow, circular walk. He was clumsy, his feet unsure, but he never took his eyes from her face. She did not teach him with words. She taught him with the slight pressure of her hand, with the gentle sway of her body. They moved in a small, tight circle, a world of two. The room, the people, the flickering lights, it all faded away. There was only the solid feel of his hand at her back, the warmth of her hand in his, the quiet intensity of his gaze. In the silence, she could hear the beating of her own heart. This was more intimate than any passionate embrace, more profound than any declaration. It was a silent vow. He, the man who believed he was feared, and she, the woman who believed she was shamed, were standing together in the light, and they were not afraid. They turned, slowly, rhythmically, finding their own music in the shared space between them. They were not led, and they did not follow. They simply moved together, two solitary souls who had finally, against all odds, found their way home to each other. The morning after was not loud with celebration, but filled with a deep, resonant quiet. The world, draped in its thick blanket of snow, seemed to be holding its breath, hushed and reverent. When Clara woke in her small room at Millie's, the light that came through her window was different, a soft, blue-white glow reflected up from the snow-covered ground, pure and clean. The town was beginning to stir, but the sounds were muffled, softened by the snow, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur of voices, the crunch of boots on a newly cleared path. She dressed not in the serviceable gray wool of her daily chores, but in the dark green dress she had made for herself. It felt different today, not a statement of defiance, but a simple declaration of fact. This is who I am. She packed her few belongings into her worn valise, her other dresses, her brush and comb, the small book of poems. It did not take long. Her life was still a thing that could be contained in a single bag, but for the first time, it did not feel meager. It felt portable, ready. She went down to the kitchen. Millie was there, a thin plume of steam rising from a mug of coffee in her hands. The older woman looked at Clara, at the green dress, at the valise by the door. Her slate-gray eyes took in the entire scene, and a slow, rare smile touched the corners of her mouth. "So," Millie said, her voice its usual gravelly rumble, "the ground has been chosen." "It has?" Clara said softly. Millie nodded, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "He's a good foundation, that one. Not much for decoration, but the timbers are sound. He won't wash away in the first flood." She set her mug down and wiped her hands on her apron, a familiar, comforting gesture. "You'll need this." She pushed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle across the table. Inside was a loaf of freshly baked bread, a wedge of cheese, and 2 dried apples, a dowry of the most practical, honest kind. "Millie, Clara started, her throat tight with emotion. "Don't say it," Millie cut her off. "Not unkindly. Gratitude is best shown, not spoken. Just build your house strong, girl. That's all the thanks an old woman needs." She turned back to the stove, her back a clear, final dismissal that was also a blessing. Clara picked up her valise and the bundle of food and stepped out onto the porch. The air was so cold it felt like a solid thing, a sharp, clean intake that burned in her lungs. The world glittered. She walked down the steps and onto the path the town had carved through the snow. People she passed nodded to her. The greetings were quiet, respectful. "Miss Whitmore." They were no longer looks of pity or suspicion. They were the simple acknowledgments of a neighbor. The storm had washed them all clean. The walk to Sawyer's cabin was one she could have made with her eyes closed. The path through the pines was now a deep, narrow canyon between walls of snow. The trees, heavy laden, drooped their branches, creating a silent, white cathedral. When she emerged into the clearing, she stopped. The cabin was there, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, looking solid and permanent against the vast backdrop of snow and sky. But something was different. She heard a sound, not the familiar thud of an axe, but the sharp, rhythmic rasp of a handsaw, followed by the decisive knock of a hammer. Sawyer was working. He was outside, his back to her, a heavy wool coat on against the cold. The old door frame of the cabin, a low, weathered thing of dark, aged wood, lay discarded in the snow like a shed skin. In its place, he was fitting a new one. He was working with fresh-cut pine, the wood a pale, clean gold against the cabin's darker logs. The scent of sawdust hung in the frigid air, a smell of creation, of new beginnings. She stood for a long time, just watching him. She watched the fluid, powerful economy of his movements, the way he measured a piece of wood not once, but twice, before making a cut. He was not just repairing something, he was building. He was a man utterly at home in his own skin, in his own world, creating a space with his own 2 hands. He was the foundation Millie had spoken of, and he was making it stronger. He must have sensed her presence, because he paused, the hammer resting in his hand, and turned. The morning sun caught the side of his face, illuminating the harsh lines and the deep quiet in his eyes. He saw her standing there, her valise in her hand, her green dress a slash of color in the white world. He did not look surprised. He looked as if he were seeing something he had been expecting, something he had been waiting for. A slow smile touched his mouth. "Clara," he said. The single word was a welcome, a question, and a statement all at once. She walked toward him, her boots crunching in the snow. She set her valise and the bundle of food down near the new wood shavings. She looked at the old door frame, then at the new one he was building. It was taller, noticeably taller. The crossbeam was a good 6 inches higher than the old one had been. She looked at him, at the focused intensity in his face as he checked the fit of a joint. A question rose in her, simple and direct. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft in the vast silence of the clearing. "Why are you changing it?" He stopped his work completely. He set his hammer down on the new wood and turned to face her fully. He wiped a hand on his trousers, his gaze never leaving her face. The sun was bright, and she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. He looked at the new, taller frame, and then he looked at her. "Because," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to come from the center of the earth, "I want you to be able to walk in without having to bow your head." The words, they were simple words, practical words about a wooden frame, but they landed in her heart with the force of a revelation. They were the most beautiful words she had ever heard. Asterisk, without having to bow your head. He was not just building a doorway. He was building a new world, a new rule for her life, a life where she did not have to make herself smaller to be accepted, a life where she was not expected to stoop, a life where her own natural stature, her spirit, her strength, her very being was the measure that everything else must be built to fit. All the years of her life, she had been bowing her head to her mother's reputation, to the condescension of employers, to the judgment of strangers, to Caleb Rourke's dismissal, to Silas Croft's contempt. She had walked through the world with a permanent, invisible stoop, an apology for her own existence. And this man, this quiet, scarred man, had seen it. He had seen the proud, straight way she held her spine, and he had understood that it was a constant, exhausting effort, and he had decided, with the simple, profound logic of his own heart, to build her a doorway she could walk through as she was. The tears came then, but they were not the hot, angry tears of frustration, nor the cold, silent tears of loneliness. They were tears of release, a warm, cleansing flood that washed away the last of the shame, the last of the fear. She did not hide them. She let him see them. She let him see her, completely and utterly undone and remade by his simple act of love. She took a step forward, then another, until she was standing right before the new doorway. It was unfinished, raw, the pine still fragrant and slightly sticky with resin. She reached out a hand, not to wipe her tears, but to touch it. She laid her palm flat against the smooth, clean-cut wood of the jamb. It felt solid, real, a beginning. Then she took a breath and stepped through. She did not duck. She did not hesitate. She did not ask for permission. She did not ask for a place. She simply walked across the threshold, her head held high, and entered the warm, quiet space of the cabin. She turned and looked at him. He was still standing outside, watching her, his face filled with a love so fierce and steady it took her breath away. He had built her a doorway, and now he was waiting, letting her claim the space as her own. For the first time, in a voice that was no longer a whisper of shame, but a quiet, certain statement of fact, a promise to him and to herself, she spoke the truth of her heart. "I'm staying. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please also consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.